So our discussion for today will be investments. And when you talk about investments kasi there are other items in the financial statements that are considered as investments. But for purposes of discussion, we will only focus on investments that are considered as financial assets. Okay? And those that are not covered by other standards. Kasi later on, we will also be discussing investments such as investment property, investment such as investment in associate, and other long-term investments. Yan. So let us first proceed with the contents. So for our topics, this will be the items that we're going to be discussing. We'll have the introduction. We'll have a discussion of the financial assets. We'll be discussing the types of securities so that we'll have an idea later on how we are going to deal with them and how we are going to relate the types of securities dun sa ating financial assets. We will have the criteria for classifying financial assets based on the standard. We have classification of financial assets ngayon based on the criteria there and measurement as well as disclosure requirements. Okay. So those are basically the items for this discussion. So let us first start with our introduction. So generally, just like based on the topics that are or the standards that are provided in the IFRS or the standards that were established by IASB, there are basically 4 standards that will cover investments under financial asset classifications or those that are generally going to talk about financial assets. So the first standard there is IFRS 9. Okay? So IFRS 9 yung first standard. Supposedly kasi IFRS 9 was intended to supersede the requirements of IAS 39. Kasi IAS 39 is also talking about financial assets, recognition, and measurement. However, as you can see, even if you look into the standards or even if you look into the website of ifrs.org, IAS 39 was not yet superseded. And the reason is because yung IFRS 39 kasi meron pa siyang contents relating to hedge accounting. So yan yun. So therefore, ganito yung concept niya. IFRS 9 is now the prevalent or the standard that is prevailing with regards to the measurement and recognition of your financial assets. IAS 39 was still retained because it still contains the hedge accounting requirements of IFRS 9. So instead of putting all the details ng hedge accounting na nandun sa IFRS 9, niretain na lang dun sa IAS 39. Also, the reason is because if you look into IFRS 9, ang haba-haba na ng standard. More than 100 pages na yung, actually almost 200 pages na nga yung IFRS 9. Unaccompanied pa yon. So, masyado nang madaming laman. So, kapag ilalagay pa dun yung requirements for hedge accounting, mas lalo pa nga haba. So, in order for the hedge accounting requirements to be discussed further, sa IAS 39 na lang na-retain yun. So, ibig sabihin, existing pa si IFRS 9 at meron pa rin si IAS 39. Pero for hedge accounting na lang. Also, we will still have IAS 32 kasi ni-retain yung standard na yan because that contains the requirements for the presentation naman ng financial instruments. So, kasama dyan yung sa financial asset, of course. Actually, yung definition nga ng financial asset nandyan pa hanggang ngayon. As well as financial liabilities and others. Then finally, we have IFRS 7. And that is for disclosures of or disclosure requirements for IFRS 9 or for financial instruments. Okay, so basically yan yung mga standards natin. So ngayon, for financial accounting and reporting purposes, out of the 4 standards, IFRS 9, IAS 39, IAS 32, and IFRS 7, tatlo lang ang isasama natin sa financial accounting and reporting. Ang kasama lang dyan will be IAS 9, IFRS 9, IAS 32 at saka IFRS 7. Huwag mong isasama yung IAS 39. Okay? Kasi for the most updated syllabus and TOS ng board examination effective October 2022, okay? Walang kasamang hedge accounting or hedging sa financial accounting and reporting. It was transferred to advanced financial accounting and reporting. So basically, hindi siya nawala sa examination na kasama pa rin siya sa licensure examination. Yun nga lang, nalipat siya ng subject. Okay? Siguro na-realize din ng BOA na sobrang dami na ng topics ng financial accounting and reporting, so nilipat na nila sa advanced financial accounting and reporting. So basically, that's the concept there. Okay? So with that, let us proceed with the discussion of financial assets. Kasi if we talk about investments, generally, before nating i-discuss yung investments, kailangan muna nating ma-establish ano bang concept ng financial assets. Okay? Kasi most of the time, the financial assets of the company will form part of the investments. Okay? So, according to IAS 32, kasi doon natin makukuha yung definition niyan, IAS 32 defines financial assets as items that fall to letter A until letter D. May katuloy pa to. So, letter A, cash. Automatic, kapag cash yung item mo, financial asset na yan. Okay? Pangalawa, equity instrument of another entity. Okay? In other words, meron kang hawak na equity instrument. I-explain natin mamaya na bang equity instrument or equity security. Letter C, kapag meron kang contractual right that satisfies either one or two. Una, to receive cash or another financial asset from another entity, or to exchange financial assets or financial liabilities with another entity under conditions that are potentially favorable to the entity. Now, in other words, ikaw yung magbe-benefit or nasa iyo yung net benefit. Kaya nga, di ba, pag sinabi nating accounts receivable and other receivables, ito rin lang yun. Diba? To receive cash or other financial assets from another entity. So, dito papasok yung loans and receivables natin. Okay? So, that's why receivables are also considered as financial assets. Okay? So, yun siya. So, generally, yan dun sa letter C. So, basta dapat contractual right siya. Pwede siya dun. Or letter D, a contract that will or may be settled in the entity's own instrument and is either number 1 or number 2. Number 1 is a non-derivative for which the entity is or may be obliged to receive a variable number of the entity's own security instruments. Okay, so ibig sabihin, ikaw, yung meron kang right to receive a variable number of an entity's, okay, the entity's own equity instrument, or a derivative that will or may be settled other than by the exchange of a fixed amount of cash or another financial asset for a fixed number of the entity's own equity instrument. So, yung number 2, syempre hindi natin covered yan kasi derivatives na yan eh. So, kapag derivatives, pasok na yan sa advanced financial accounting and reporting. Okay, so basically, non-derivative, pwede siyang contract that will be settled in the entity's own equity instrument and is a non-derivative. Okay, so ibig sabihin hindi siya contract in relation to hedge accounting, for which the entity is or may be obliged to receive a variable number of the entity's own equity instrument. So in other words, parang ang ipang-settle nito is yung entity, yung sariling equity security ng entity. Okay, pero variable number. Okay? Pag dito sa derivative, okay, fixed number of shares, okay, or fixed amount of cash. Okay, so ganun naman yung mangyari yan. Okay, so to go back, ito yung mga items na pwedeng pumasok sa financial asset. Cash, equity instrument ng ibang entity, contractual right na pasok dito sa 1 and 2 classification, and number 4, contracts that will be settled in the entity's own equity instrument. Okay, so yan yung financial asset. So generally, you just need to understand that kasi by the way, I forgot to provide how many items are you going to expect na lalabas pagdating sa investments, okay, na covered by IFRS 9. So that's basically going to be around 1 to 2 questions lang ulit. Okay? Kasi ratio and proportion, malamang maximum na yung dalawang question doon. Okay. So yan yung sa ating financial assets. So with that, punta na tayo sa types of securities. Okay? You need to know how to classify or how to qualify as a security kasi later on, the classification of the item, okay, will be dependent dun sa nature din ng security. Okay? So, your equity securities, unahin natin yon kasi tatlo yan eh. We have equity securities, debt securities, and hybrid or yung tinatawag nating compound financial instruments. Okay? So, let's go first with equity securities. Ang equity securities, okay, these are pertaining to equity or ownership interest held by shareholders of or in an entity, either a company, partnership, or trust, realized in the form of shares of capital stock, which include shares of either common or preferred stock. Kasi dalawa lang naman yung general na classification natin dyan. So kapag equity security or when you talk about equity security, it simply talks about the ownership of instruments that are representing the equity of another entity. Okay, generally this will talk about common and preferred stock. Okay? Although meron ding mga ibang equity securities pa such as warrants, rights, options, yung mga ganun, considered pa rin kasi yun na equity securities ng ibang entity na kapag hawak mo, considered siya na parang investment mo. Okay? So, ganun yung kwento nun. So, yun siya. Holders of equity securities are typically not entitled to regular payments, although equity securities often do pay out dividends. So, ito yung dividends, cash flow na makukuha mo from a particular equity instrument. But they are able to profit from capital gains as well. Okay? So, ano naman yung capital gains? Ito yung pag-i-increase ng value ng equity securities. Usually, syempre, based yan sa active market. So, kunyari, nabili mo ng 5 piso, tapos naging 7 pesos, so may capital gain ka na 2 pesos. Parang ganun lang yung ibig sabihin. Also, remember that equity securities are entitled the holder to some control of the company on a pro rata basis, either through voting rights or other similar rights, no? Okay? In case of bankruptcy, they share only in residual interest. Alam naman na natin yan. I-discuss natin yan later pag nasa equity na tayo or nasa shareholders equity. So generally, yan ang equity securities natin. Okay, ano naman ang debt security? So pag sinabi nating debt security, ito ay utang ng ibang entity. Okay? So in other words, tayo ay pag sinabi nating debt security, this is an instrument, okay, either a contract or whatever type of instrument that represents borrowed money that must be repaid with terms that stipulate the size of the loan, interest rate, and maturity or renewal date. So generally, debt instruments pertain to pautang ng isang entity sa isa pang entity. So may hawak tayong katibayan na may utang sila, so yun yung debt security natin. Okay? So debt securities which include government and corporate bonds. Okay, kasi usually ganun din kapag pinag-uusapan natin ng debt securities, generally bonds ang ginagamit na examples. Although of course, since financial asset ang pinag-uusapan natin, yung normal na loans and receivables, they are also considered as they are also considered as financial assets. Pero generally kasi wala namang security or wala namang document that usually represent that, particularly kapag accounts receivable lang pinag-uusapan kasi open account yun eh. Yung notes receivable at saka yung loans receivable, meron pa. Pwede pa yun. Okay? So anyway, ito yung mga samples ng debt securities. Pwedeng government and corporate bonds, pwedeng certificates of deposit, collateralized securities such as CDOs and CMOs. Okay? So, explain natin kung ano yung mga, pero generally, ano lang naman yan eh, collateralized lang naman lahat ng mga yan. May mga collateralized borrowings. Okay, generally entitle the holder to regular payments of interest and repayment of principal. Okay? So, importante din yan kasi kapag sinabi nating debt securities, ito ang general na cash flow na makukuha mo. Ang makukuha mo dyan is interest at saka principal. Okay? Tapos, under debt securities, they are typically issued for a fixed term and at the end of which they can be redeemed by the issuer. Okay? So, kumbaga, babawiin na ng issuer yon yung security kasi nga fully paid na. So, kumbaga, ibibigay kung tayo yung nagpautang, isasaulo natin sa kanya yung instrument kasi nabayaran na tayo. So, parang ganoon yung concept na. So, debt securities can be secured. Ibig sabihin, this is collateralized or backed. Okay? Or unsecured naman. And if unsecured, may be contractually prioritized over other unsecured subordinated debt in the case of a bankruptcy. Ito naman, papasok na tong topic, tong concept na to, yung nasa huli, kapag nandun ka na sa corporate liquidation later on, which is part of advanced financial accounting and reporting. So generally, yun yun, di ba? Kasi kapag secured, may tinatawag tayong partially secured at saka may tinatawag tayong fully secured. So yun, ano na yun? Secured na yun. So di na siya kasama sa mga unsecured. Kapag napasok sa unsecured, dun mo na i-determine kung yan ba ay with priority or without priority. Pero sa ano, again, sa ano na yun, advanced financial accounting and reporting na. So, ang importante lang dito sa debt securities, alam natin na ang debt security ay katibayan na may pinautang tayo sa isang entity at ang tatanggapin nating payment dyan is generally going to be principal and interest payments. Okay? So, we now go to hybrid securities. Ang hybrid security, yan yung pinaghalong may debt, may pinaghalo ding equity. Or pwede rin naman na equity siya, pero dalawang klase ng equity instrument yung nandoon sa loob ng kontrata or nandoon sa loob ng security. So dito pumapasok yung concept ng bifurcation or pagsi-split ng mga components ng isang compound financial instrument. Okay? So generally what you're going to do is you need to recognize separately the components of a compound financial instrument. Okay? So, ganun lang naman yung concept niya. So, meron tayong mga problem solvings relating to the bifurcation or the splitting of the components of a compound or a hybrid security. Okay? Kasi hindi mo siya pwedeng i-recognize as a single amount. Talagang hinihiwalay yan kasi magkaiba yung purpose ng mga yan. So, that's generally the concept of hybrid securities. Okay? So, ganun din, kapag na-split mo na yung hybrid securities, magka-classify din yan as either debt or equity later on. So, yan siya. So, with that, we now go to the criteria for classifying financial assets. Okay? So, doon sa provisions ng ating standard, dalawa lang naman ang basis talaga para ma-classify mo ang financial asset. That is basically to analyze the business model and the cash flow characteristic of the instrument that you are holding. Okay? So, business model ng company, tapos cash flow characteristic ng security na hawak natin. So, discuss natin yung business model. Okay? Ang business model kasi ng isang entity, usually dalawa lang yan. Okay? Pag sinabi nating business model, hindi yung business model ng buong entity ha. Ang concept niyan is the business model in handling the security. Or what is the business model of the entity when it comes to the financial assets that it is holding. Okay, so yun siya. So, dyan, ang old na tawag kasi dyan is management intention. Pero kasi, management intention and business model are two different topics no or two different ideas. Ang concept ng business model, ito talaga ang gagawin. Okay, so ganoon siya. Ang business model is pertaining to kung ano talaga ang ginagawa ng business kapag may hawak silang ganitong klase ng instrument. Ang management intention, pwedeng magbago-bago yan eh. Okay? So, yun yung concept nan. Pwedeng ang management intention una, i-hold tapos biglang nagpalit siya ng management intention na niya bigla ibenta. Ganun. So regardless kung magbago ang management intention, we will stick with the business model. Okay? Yan yung reason kung bakit kapag kunyari, ang isang instrument, ang business model is to hold it for the collection of principal and interest or for the collection of contractual cash flow, tapos yung portion niya, yung portion ng security binenta, hindi nagbabago yung business model. The business model will remain o kahit nasabihin mong nagkaroon ng partial derecognition or partial na pagbebenta. Okay, so ganun siya. May mga, mas explain natin siya further later on. So ito yung dalawang business model. First business model is to take advantage of fluctuations in market prices and sell the assets. In other words, ang balak mong gawin dun sa instrument, ibebenta mo later on kapag kikita ka na or kapag napansin mo na mag-earn ka na. Tapos, yung second na business model naman natin is collect contractual cash flows. So, kaya mo hawak yung instrument na yan kasi gusto mong makolekta lahat yung contractual cash flows relating to that item. Okay? So, yan. Tapos, aside from that, meron din tayong tinatawag na cash flow characteristics. Kasi kailangan nating ma-determine kung ano ba yung makukuha natin na cash flow from that particular instrument. Okay? So, yun yung gusto nating sabihin dyan. So, ngayon, dalawa ang klase ng cash flow, no? Una, cash flow in the form of principal and interest. Okay? At pangalawa, cash flow na others na. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya principal and interest. So, dito na papasok yung dividends, capital gains, etc. Or whatever kind of cash flow na makukuha mo, basta hindi siya principal and interest. Okay, so yun lang naman yan. So basically, kung babalikan natin, kapag magka-classify tayo ng financial asset, tinitignan natin parehas yung business model at saka cash flow characteristic ng instrument na hawak natin. Okay? So with that, let us go to the classification of financial assets. Okay? So unahin natin si financial asset measured at amortized cost. Okay? So according to the standard, para maging amortized cost ang classification ng isang instrument, kailangan niyang masatisfy si letter A at letter B. Sabi both of the following conditions are met. So ano yung first? First na condition, the financial asset is held with a business model whose objective is to hold financial assets in order to collect contractual cash flows. So yun yung, 'di ba, dalawa lang yung business model natin kanina. So ang business model daw dapat para maging amortized cost, collect contractual cash flows. Tapos, and letter B, the contractual terms of the financial asset give rise on specified dates to cash flows that are solely payments of principal and interest. So, para maging amortized cost, number 1, ang business model dapat ay to collect contractual cash flows at ang cash flow characteristic dapat principal and interest. So in other words, ang amortized cost classification, kung babalikan natin yung mga klase ng instrument, ano ang instrument na pwedeng maging amortized cost? Ang sagot ay debt instrument. Okay? So debt instrument lang ang pwedeng maging amortized cost. Ang equity instrument, wala kasi siyang pwedeng i-hold mo yung contractual cash flows pero wala namang principal and interest na equity. Okay? Now, you might be saying, sir, paano yung mga instrument na equity siya in form pero debt siya in substance? So, ganun pa rin siya. Ang labas doon, pwedeng equity kung in substance siya ay debt instrument. So, kumbaga, substance over form pa rin. So, example, yung redeemable preference shares natin, they can be considered as financial assets at amortized cost kasi even though the form is in equity, the substance is in debt naman siya or substance is debt instrument pa rin siya. So, technically, susundan pa rin natin yung requirement nito, it will still be considered as amortized cost pa rin. Okay? So, yun yung concept natin dyan. Punta tayo sa kasunod naman, okay? Yung sa kasunod naman, ano naman ang fair value through other comprehensive income? Okay? Paano mo maika-classify or kailan mo ika-classify yung isang instrument as fair value through other comprehensive income? Sabi, letter A, the financial asset, take note if both the following conditions are met. The financial asset is held within a business model whose objective is achieved by both collecting contractual cash flows and selling financial assets. So, anong gustong mangyari nito? Nangongolekta na nga ng contractual cash flows, magbebenta pa. Okay? Magbebenta pa ng financial asset. Okay? So, ibig sabihin therefore, ano siya? Siya ay magiging dual purpose. Kumbaga, dual ang kanyang business model. Gusto na nga niyang mangolekta ng cash flows, gusto pa niyang ibenta later on. So, kapag ganyan ang business model, okay, fair value through other comprehensive income na yan. Pero, take note, meron pa. And, the contractual terms of the financial asset give rise on specified dates to cash flows that are solely payments of principal and interest in the principal amount outstanding. Okay? So, ano ibig sabihin yan? Yung classification as financial or financial asset at fair value through other comprehensive income will now be debt instrument lang ulit. Okay? Debt instrument lang ulit. Okay? Pero may caveat tayo dyan. Okay? Kasi meron tayong tinatawag na designated later on. May tinatawag tayong designated. Okay? Explain natin siya later on. So, basically, ganito yung mangyari ngayon dyan. Yung amortized cost classification, debt instrument lang dapat. Yung fair value through other comprehensive income, dapat debt instrument din lang siya. Kasi yun yung nakalagay na provision dito. Okay? So, ngayon, may tinatawag pa tayong pangatlo, yung fair value to profit or loss. So, lahat ng mga items na hindi pasok doon sa requirements na una nating na-discuss, hindi siya financial asset measured at amortized cost, hindi rin siya fair value through other comprehensive income, pasok na siya as fair value through profit or loss. Okay? So, yun ang magiging classification niya kung hindi siya pasok dun sa dalawa. Okay. So, ngayon, ano ang mangyari dito? Since ang fair value to profit or loss classifications is basically a catch-all category, it means that fair value to profit or loss can be equity and it can be debt also. So, pwede siyang equity, pwede rin siyang debt instrument. Okay, so yun siya. Ngayon, ito yung sinasabi natin na caveat kanina. Kasi, there is a possibility of designation. Okay? Pag sinabi nating designation or designated financial instrument, ito yung tinutukoy natin, designated financial instrument, yan yung mga ina-classify na natin siya at a certain classification para magkaroon ng accounting symmetry between the issuer at saka yung recipient ng security. Yung nag-issue ng security at saka yung tatanggap ng security. Or para magkaroon or para maiwasan natin yung accounting mismatch. So, accounting symmetry means parehas ang treatment, hindi magkakaroon ng accounting mismatch. So, according to the standard, pwedeng mag-designate ng instrument as fair value through profit or loss at pwede ring mag-designate ng instrument at fair value through other comprehensive income. Okay? So, meaning, pwede rin pala na ang isang equity instrument ay maging fair value through other comprehensive income kung i-designate natin siya. Yun siya. Pero, again, another caveat, kapag dinesignate siya, hindi siya pwedeng ma-reclassify. Kapag na-designate siya, hindi siya pwedeng i-reclassify. Okay, so ano yung first caveat natin? First caveat natin, kahit hindi na-meet yung requirements, kung dinesignate siya, pwede pa rin. Okay? Tapos pangalawang caveat, kapag dinesignate na, hindi na pwedeng i-reclassify. Okay? Yun yung consideration natin dyan. Okay. So that's basically yung classification natin ng financial assets. Okay? So with that, punta na tayo dun sa measurement of financial assets. So madali lang naman yung measurement natin ng financial assets. Siyempre, kailangan mo lang sundan yung ating provisions ng standard. So unahin natin si amortized cost kasi mas madali yon, no? So si financial asset at amortized cost, meron tayong initial at saka subsequent measurement. So for initial measurement, ang gagawin natin dyan, kunin mo yung fair value ng instrument plus yung transaction cost niyan. So again, nakita mo na naman yung word na fair value. So pag sinabi natin fair value, di ba? Diniscuss natin yan last time. Kapag may nakita kang fair value at walang sinabing specifically yung standard kung ano yung fair value na yan, it means that it is talking about fair value as discussed by IFRS 13. So, yung fair value ng financial asset natin can be in the form of market or quoted prices. Yan yung level 1, yung first priority natin. Second priority is observable data. Ibig sabihin, we are going to get the fair value by relating it to another similar instrument. Tapos pangatlo, yung unobservable data, which are estimates or judgments coming from the entity itself. So yun yung tinutukoy na fair value dyan. Plus transaction cost, kung magkano man yung nagastos mo to prepare the asset for its intended purpose, no? Or basically relating to consummating the transaction for that financial asset. So yun yung initial measurement natin dyan. Okay? Subsequently, what are we going to do? We are going to amortize, kasi nga amortize cost, di ba? So we are going to amortize the asset using effective interest method. So pag sinabi nating amortized using effective interest method, yan din yung similar treatment na ginagawa natin doon sa loans and receivables natin. And again, talking about amortized cost using effective interest method, babalikan na naman natin yung concept na kapag hindi mo alam yung effective interest, interpolation is necessary. And in the process of interpolation, it is beneficial if you know how to use or how to estimate the effective interest using the straight line amortization muna. Okay, tas from there, doon ka na mag-interpolate. Okay, so generally, yan yung tinutukoy natin dyan. Pero tayo sa next, financial asset at fair value through other comprehensive income naman. So actually, self-explanatory kasi alam mo na yung from the definition ng financial asset itself, alam mo kung anong gagawin. So for financial asset at fair value through other comprehensive income, initial measurement is same with or similar with financial asset at amortized cost. You're going to get the fair value plus transaction cost ulit. Okay, so kunin mo yung fair value plus transaction cost is going to be the initial measurement. Tapos subsequently, you're going to measure it at fair value again. So kukunin mo yung fair value at every reporting period with changes in fair value reflected in other comprehensive income. So, if you are done or if you are still familiar with the components of other comprehensive income as presented in IAS 1, okay, so kasama yan yung mga fair value changes ng financial asset at FVOC doon sa papasok sa OCI. Although marami pang laman yung OCI. Pero sa kanya natin i-discuss yun kapag nandun na tayo sa financial statements. And take note, and accumulated in equity. So, ibig sabihin, it will be retained doon sa equity component ng ating financial statement. In other words, kapag nagkaroon ng bentahan, okay, pag nagkaroon ng bentahan ng financial instrument classified as FVOC, yung realized portion will also be part of equity. So may tinatawag kasi tayong realized at saka unrealized gain or losses. Yun ay sa equity papasok. Okay? Or hindi siya pwedeng pumasok sa P&L. Okay. And finally, we have fair value For financial assets at fair value to profit or loss. So, initial measurement, it will be measured at fair value ulit. Okay? Tapos, 'di ba, ito lang yung naiiba kasi siya nga yung catch-all category. So, for financial assets at FVPL, it will be measured at fair value. However, transaction cost is expensed. Okay? The transaction cost will be expensed. Okay? Yun siya. Yun lang yung main difference niyan. Tapos, sa subsequent measurement, of course, the fair value will be based again on whatever measurement you have. Okay? Again, relating to IFRS 13. Pero the changes will be reflected in profit or loss. Yan. So, kung ako yung tatanungin, actually, FVPL at saka FVOC will all be the same eventually. Kasi yung FVPL, i-close mo rin lang naman yan sa equity portion. Okay? Diba, i-close mo rin lang sa retained earnings yan. So, ganun din, yung FVOC, kapag na-realize mo lahat ng gains and losses niyan, sa retained earnings din naman eventually i-close yan. But of course, matter of classification kasi yan. So, sundan lang natin yung classification requirements at measurement requirements ng standard. Okay? Yan siya. Ang point ko lang is eventually, it will all boil down to the item being part of retained earnings kapag na-realize na siya eventually. Okay. So, yan siya. So, with that, we go to the disclosure requirements already. So, sinabi na natin kanina, ang disclosure requirements sa IFRS 7 yan, makukuha. Yung presentation, hindi na natin diniscuss yung presentation kasi it's the same naman eh. Diba? It will be current or non-current, depende. Kasi diba, depende yan doon sa period before or kung kailan mo siya makokolekta. Basically, ganun siya, diba? So, parang yung diniscuss natin sa loans and receivables, malamang yung mga financial assets mong yan and investments, no? These are not considered as trade items. So, kung hindi siya trade items, then it will be considered as non-trade. So, kung non-trade siya, ang classification lang natin dyan will be kapag 1 year or less, current. Kapag more than 1 year, non-current. So, ganun lang naman yan. Tapos, pwede mong tanongin, sir, paano yung mga equity instruments? Yung equity instruments na hawak ko, wala naman siyang maturity. So, anong mangyari dyan? So, technically, yung mga trading securities or yung mga FVPL, they will be classified as current assets. Tapos, yung FVOC securities, they will be generally non-current naman. Okay, so ganun yung classification. Yung financial asset at amortized cost, i-consider mo siya as i-consider mo siya as current or non-current asset depende dun sa maturity ng ating instrument na hawak. Okay, so ganun siya. Yan. Tapos, bago natin ituloy yung disclosure, another concern, paano naman sir yung mga dealers ng securities? O, diba, may equity security tayong tinutukoy, tapos dealer in security siya. So, na-discuss na natin yung inventory. Kapag dealer ka, hindi considered as investment yung mga hawak mong securities. These are considered as inventories. And therefore, they are part of current assets under inventories. Sundan mo lang yung measurement requirement na nandoon sa inventory. Okay, so with that, we now move on to the disclosures. So under IFRS 7, dalawa kasi ang main category ng ating disclosure requirements. So yung first will be yung disclosure, which will provide information about the significance of financial instruments on financial performance and position. Okay, or ano daw effect niya sa balance sheet, anong effect niya sa ating income statement or comprehensive income. So, this will include disclosures on the carrying value of each of the categories of financial instrument. So, carrying value. So, ibig sabihin, ito yung mga FVPL ko. Ito yung carrying value, ito yung computation details. Tapos, ito yung mga FVOC ko, ito yung details, computation, etc. Ito yung mga amortized cost, etc. So, ganun lang. Amounts recognized in profit or loss with respect to financial instruments. Okay, so, syempre, kung ang nangyari lang naman dyan, kung may laman doon sa P&L mo na parang realized or unrealized gains or losses, okay, so you're simply going to present that or i-disclose mo doon sa notes paano mo na-compute yung mga yan. Pangatlo, descriptions of hedging arrangements. Of course, hedging arrangements will be disclosed, pero this is part of AFAR already. This is relating to the hedging transactions that you entered into. Okay? So, AFAR na yan. Pero disclosure requirements pa rin kasi yan. So, isama natin. So, last, no, yung sa fourth bullet point, information about fair values of each class of financial instrument. Okay? Fair values of each class of financial instrument. So, ibig sabihin, kung naka-amortize cost, hanapin mo, ibibigay mo pa rin yung fair value. Okay? Kasi sinabi each class eh. Yung fair value through profit or loss at saka fair value through other comprehensive income, wala nang problema yon. Okay? Kasi naka-fair value na talaga yon. Pero yung financial asset at amortized cost, although naka-amortized cost siya, you still need to disclose the fair value. Basically, this is for valuation purposes lang naman. Okay? And full disclosure requirements lang. Okay? So, yun lang naman yung consideration natin dyan. So, yun yung first type ng ating disclosure. Punta tayo sa pangalawang set. Yung second set of disclosure will be information about the nature and extent of risks arising from financial instruments, including ano yung mga risks na kailangan nating i-disclose, qualitative disclosures describing risk exposures for each type of financial instruments, and management of risk. So, meron kang FVPL, ano yung mga possible risk involved dyan. Okay? Tapos, ano daw ang ginagawa ng management in order to mitigate or in order to control the risk. Okay, bakit ito tinatanong? Bago natin sagutan yan, ano pa yung pangalawang requirement? Second requirement, quantitative disclosures including summary, quantitative data about exposure to risk at the reporting date and specific exposure to credit, liquidity, and market risk. Kung maaalala nyo pa yung diniscuss natin doon sa loans and receivable na meron tayong pinresent na table, yan yun. Yung quantitative data or computation, yan yung, di ba, yung 12 month at saka yung lifetime, di ba? Yung dinidiscuss natin before na ganun. Yun, i-compute mo yun, okay? At yung mga risks na involved doon sa ating instrument. Tapos, specific exposure to credit, liquidity, and market risk. Okay, so yan. Bakit yan pinapa-require na disclosure? Kasi kasama yan sa pag-assess ng users of financial information sa stewardship ng management doon sa mga assets or resources na hawak ng entity. Yan. So kaya kailangan ding sagutin yan ng ating preparer or ng company para mapanatag lang yung loob ng mga investors ng company na meron tayong or may paraan yung company to mitigate or to lessen the risks involved dito sa ating instruments. So with that is already the end of our presentation.